My assignment today is actually to, in a way, set the scene and the context for our discussions. We have three really other panel speakers who have contributed a great deal to the theoretical debate and discussions about the rise of China. And I'm sort of thinking in front of this audience, and many of you are experts and very knowledgeable and informed about China's rise and various debates surrounding China's rise. So what sort of scene setting that I could do? What I think I might be able to do in setting the scene to me would be to try to talk about the rise of China in sort of two separate dimensions. Perhaps the first one a bit more quickly, which is the sort of to what extent current international relations theories have been able to help us and inform us about what's going on and what are the implications of China's rise. The other one, which probably a bit more central in my current sort of thinking about how do we understand China's rise, is what exactly is this particular player about? And these sort of two themes, I sort of use sort of two phrases. The first one, actually inspired by John, when we had a workshop dealing with China's rise and its implication for regional governance in East Asia some time ago in Hong Kong. And then we had a lot of debates about, okay, what would be the best way of explaining what's going on and all that. And of course, then we go back to the theoretical literature and the debate. And after much debate among ourselves, then we feel that almost none of the IR theories have been able to provide a very comprehensive and good explanation of what happened. And thus, sort of, we had this notion about a frustrated grand theory in international relations that somehow, none of the perspectives managed to explain what's going on. The other one is also a different form of frustration, perhaps not so much about frustrated international relations theory, but about rising power, which in itself might see things very differently. And that is, the rising power is actually also a frustrated power. We think about China as a global power and think about all these various other things that now being associated with such an important global power, the number 2 largest economy in the world and various other things, then again, it should be a power that would have the kind of recognition accorded to really a major great power. And yet, I think if you look at news stories about China, I think it is a far more sort of ambivalent story about this particular global power. And to what extent this power, if it is recognized in terms of economically, politically, and even perhaps culturally, it seems that the sort of projection of such a power doesn't seem to, or the rise of such a power doesn't seem to have the projection that perhaps people, both internationally and within China, would expect. So these sort of are the two themes. I think the first one I would not go through the first one in great details. We actually do have people here who are in some ways representing the different perspectives in explaining China's international behavior. All three other panelists actually have really written extensively on the subject from different perspectives. I usually would use sort of a PowerPoint, and then with photos of Professor David Tang, John, then, and saying, okay, these are the things that they said. So today I don't need that PowerPoint. The three are here today, right? And they can speak for themselves. But what I think is, if you think about, of course, the most important thing, if you think about the rise of China, that would be associated, of course, with the realist position about the rising of a particular major country, and then what would be the consequences. We don't have a new realist or one of these people here on the panel, but we do have this sort of debate. And the rise of China will, of course, from that kind of perspective, would create a major problem internationally, leading to conflict and war, much greater tension. And then other people, of course, come in and provide different explanations. John probably can walk us through a more liberal perspective on how the liberal order actually shaped China's international behavior. We have David here who can talk about the history and identity and how all these things shaped China's international behavior. But what has been happening recently seems to almost China is behaving in such a way that seems to be contradicting one set of theory at one point and then contradicting another set of theory at another point. When we sort of almost feel that, okay, this idea of China's peaceful rise seems to be the dominant sort of, approach that the Chinese leadership had used in presenting and projecting its influences internationally and in the neighboring region. And that might, be perhaps some kind of rejection of a power politics approach in understanding China's rise. And then maybe the institutions do play a role, or maybe the fact that, China's relationship with the rest of Asia really are more rooted in history would be the more important reason why China managed to, have this approach of a peaceful rise. So, and then, we have, just last year, of course, all sorts of problems in the region. South China Sea, we have problems in Korea, and then China suddenly seems to be behaving in ways that the realists would be, happy about, in a, of course, perverse sense of that word. Then, okay, this actually proves that China is behaving as a power-seeking, sort of rising power, And then we are down the road, we are going to see more turbulence and problems, and all sorts of other things. So how do we capture all that? I mean, that's, I think, one issue. And to me, perhaps, one important thing, we can go into theoretical debates, but to me, first, probably, and every theorist would recognize that it is, even as people construct ideas about how to explain things, I think everyone will have to accept that certain limitations, and maybe we need to look at things a bit more broadly. A power transition, for example, is probably far more complex than what has been, presented. And then we do have, far sort of different processes at work, institutions do play a role, values and other things, all come together. So it's really a complex phenomenon. And I'll leave the theory building behind, but to me, and move on to the other dimension, which I think perhaps is also a key in understanding China's international behavior. And what actually are we talking about when we talk about China? To what extent we can understand the rise of China from China's perspective? One important thing is we think from China's perspective, one fundamental issue is is there a single Chinese perspective about how to sort of behave and how to project its influences? And we have multiple images. We have at one point, for example, recently China's ability, for example, to help its citizens in Libya, 35,000 of them, sort of, returning to China in safety as, one of these example of China's capability internationally. We have, of course, examples of China now becoming a bit more responsible internationally through peacekeeping, through all these various other operations. But then, of course, this year we also had all these other issues. Internationally, China's response to the award of the Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo, for example. We do have all these sort of, various other things. Now, is this a problem of explaining China's behavior in a different way, or are there something underlying in sort of post-peaceful rise that, China is revealing a very different characteristic that the so-called low-profile Tao Guangyang Hui diplomacy is now being abandoned. And then, when we try to look at all this sort of multiple, sometimes conflicting international behavior of China, by looking at exactly, what's happening from within, scholars, I think, have tried to, for example, engage with debates and discussions and try to learn more about how things work in terms of policy making, in terms of how the different players and actors behave, and then we can sort of find some way of identifying and learning about exactly, what drives China's international behavior. But then the more I think we dig into all this, and the deeper we try to, get into what actually happened, in some ways, the more sort of confused that we have become. A recent article, for example, by David Schambau on how coping with a conflicting China, I think, is an example of how a scholar go through sort of, trying to engage with the some of those people active in the, perhaps not in the core of decision making, but the wider policy community, influential international relations scholars, what are the views they're articulating. And then, of course, he come up with this sort of spectrum of people who, those belonging more to the more realist camp, to those who are far more globalist, or even some of them could be considered as constructivist in nature. And then in presenting a story about, when we try to understand all these, we are actually dealing with a much wider spectrum of ideas and competing debates within China. He actually concluded in a way by saying the realist sort of perspective seems to be a bit more dominant in shaping Chinese international behavior. Schambau, I think, spent time in Beijing and collecting information, and actually did the field presentation on that before he published that article. And I was at a couple of those events, and some of the Chinese scholars actually responded in ways which were very interesting. And they were saying, no way, the realists are actually not dominating. We have people who look at international relations and how China is going to develop its foreign policy from very different ways, and they're not realists, they are also very influential. So to them, this is not really, a very clear-cut conclusion about where China is sort of heading by just looking at even the internal debate and discussions. So, there are people who talk about China has to be transformed in a way that would move away from sort of the more traditional thinking about power politics and the rise of great power, and moving towards perhaps not what Robert Salick described as responsible stakeholder, but actually more engaged and active in international affairs that would take care of China's interests, but China's interests are becoming very different now. Wang Jishi, the Dean of International Relations at Peking University, I think recently wrote in Foreign Affairs, for example, about how China's sort of, in terms of defining China's foreign policy and the fundamental motivating factors that are driving China's policy actually have been changing. even though there always is concern about sovereignty, security, and development, but these, the concepts are all now becoming, moving away from, say, earlier days. What does it mean when China think about security these days? For example, far more concerns about non-traditional security, or when China think about development, again, it's moving away from more traditional form of economic efficiency, but thinking more about other things like in terms of Hu Jintao's so-called scientific theory on a more balanced development. So even from sort of internally, the debates and the thinking about what it means to be a major power is in flux. And in many ways, I think this sort of generation of Chinese leaders and those in the policy community are engaged in such a debate. And both the international and domestic environments are actually changing rather rapidly. And as a result, I think we are seeing China in transition again, and therefore how to understand the projection of Chinese power and the rise of China and what is going to happen after peaceful rise. We have to understand these kind of changes that are shaping China's behavior and not simply looking at the linear projection of Chinese power. I'll stop here.